Um, kind of giving us a lease overview and important items you like to see in leases to best protect landlords.
So leases are really, really broad. And if you are, all right, so we're just going to jump into this. If you have 50 units, you need to have a good lease. And you're probably needing to pay somebody to prepare a good lease for you. A good residential lease should last you for at least 10 years before it needs to be updated. A good commercial lease, if you're doing commercial property, should last you for longer than that. If you are leasing one space, you can probably get by on a shitty lease. You probably can. If you are trying to save money and maximize profit margin, you can probably get by. But the more units that you lease, the more you're going to be playing the numbers game where there's going to be a tenant who is a trouble tenant. And you're going to wish that you had done something. For most people who are just starting out, there's a realistic level of how much can you afford to spend? And I like to think that I'm pretty reasonable. Most people start businesses, most people start being a landlord by taking risks and running with it until they have to make an adjustment. And that adjustment is normally going to be pretty painful. It's going to suck. And then you're going to adjust and then you're going to deal with it. But hopefully, that period of time before you have to make an adjustment is enough for you to get your feet underneath you so that you can then afford to be able to get a lease done by an attorney, be able to get an eviction done. And you've got to cross your fingers a little bit and hope that that first trouble tenant doesn't turn into a massive deal that is going to just handicap you going forward. So that's a level of realism. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just saying that is how a lot of people start. So if that's where you're at, that's fine. That's how a lot of people start. Best practices is if we assume you have all the money in the world, you should have a good lease. If Steve Jobs, no, we'll use somebody who's alive. So if I don't know, some random rich person comes in and says, you know what, I feel like being a huge real estate mogul. I'm going to purchase a big old property in Southern California that has 500 units in it. They're not going to walk into that place and deal with the leases of the prior landlord. They're going to put all those tenants onto a new lease that they have approved and sent through a lawyer. So best practices are have a good lease. A good lease is going to have several things in it as a minimum. It's going to have a defined term of lease. It's going to be defining the rental rate. It's going to be defining the late fees. It's going to be defining the security deposit. And it's going to be defining very specifically the leased premises. Sometimes that's as simple as this unit. Sometimes it's more complicated than that, especially if you have outbuildings or if you have a hangar or if you have some portion of something weird. So make sure that if your leased space is weird, that's another trigger for you to have a better lease than normal. Okay, those are the main three. But on top of the main three, you have to have a clause for what happens if any of these provisions are breached. What is your default provision? And you have to make sure with any leases that you grab from the internet that you're not giving a tenant more time than they would be entitled to underneath Alaska law. So the way that it works in Alaska is that, and I'm just going to limit this to Alaska, but it's probably pretty similar in other states. But for Alaska, the court will allow for the most time, either by statute or by lease. To say it differently, the amount specified by statute for certain violations or for certain things to occur is the minimum amount of time. But if you put in your lease a different amount of time that is more than the minimum, the court will enforce that. And so it could be something simple to say, oh, the minimum amount of time to terminate a lease that's month to month in Alaska is 30 days, measured backwards from the day that rent is due. Great. But if your lease says 60 days, that's what's going to be enforced. So you need to be making sure that whatever lease you grab from the internet is consistent with Alaska law. And again, that's best practices. If you can't do that, if you can't afford to do that, then that's just one of the risks that you're going to be running. But best practices do that. So you're looking at term, you're looking at security deposit, late fee, you're looking at default provision. You need to be having a choice of law provision As an attorney, I love that. You need to be having a provision that says that you are not limiting your attorney fees. The statutes in Alaska allow you to be recovering your full reasonable attorney fees, which is legal speak for 100%. If you say anything other than that, you are again doing the same thing I mentioned before, where you're limiting the amount that you're allowed to recover. And then there should be provisions, well, those are the minimums. I have about 40 other provisions that I would recommend be in there, but those are the things that you absolutely have to have. I'll give you an example of some of the things that would be nice to have. It would be nice to have a clause that talked about what happens if a force majeure event happened, such as an earthquake or your tenant dies or something crazy that's outside of the norm, like a war or a terrorist attack or something crazy. That's a clause that's nice to have. Another clause that's nice to have is a clause on parking and utilities and what happens when with junk removal and what happens with additional costs and fees. Do they count as rent? Do they count as fees? All those things are really, really good, but they're not vital like the other ones. Okay.